So let's sum up price controls. So when the government imposes price controls, whether we're talking about price floors or price ceilings, three things happen. First, some people are made better off. The winners are those who get the protection. So the farmers who get the price floor that support the crops, the people that keep their jobs that are working minimum wage, they get like the new higher minimum wage. And what was the other example? Oh, rent control. Yes, the people that are able to afford the cheaper apartments. They're all made better off. They're winners in this situation. But some people are made worse off. Because in competitive market equilibrium, we're at the greatest level of producer and consumer surplus. If you want to make someone better off, you have to make someone else worse off. So in this case, the losers are those who are priced out of the market. In this case, it's the landlords. It's the people that are buying the more expensive agricultural products. It's the people that are unable to get jobs at the new higher minimum wage. And it's the firms that are paying higher prices or higher wages to their employees. And overall, the economy suffers. Deadweight loss is going to occur when we're setting a price that's outside the one determined equilibrium. So overall, we get this smaller pie to split up because of these transactions that are no longer taking place. Now, what we've gone through primarily is positive analysis of what happens, showing that there is going to be deadweight loss, showing that some consumer surplus goes to producer surplus or vice versa. We've shown that there's significant cost in terms of deadweight loss. But you can still make the normative judgments that these are worth it. You can say, yes, despite these costs, the benefit to doing this for maybe equity is a concern, and you have other, I don't know, fairness concerns or something else. You can say the benefit of that outweighs the deadweight loss that's happening and outweighs switching consumer and producer surplus, some of that being captured by the other party. If you make that argument, you kind of have to show your math, say like, provide some evidence that it really is worth it. But you can still leave it up to normative judgments. And you can still make an argument for those things. But it's important, we need to recognize the cost and recognize what's going to happen when we use price controls to move the market out of equilibrium. Back in the 1970s, we saw runaway inflation, and policymakers were desperate to try to figure out what to do. Some of the inflation was driven by a supply shock from OPEC. The oil producers began to flex their muscles for the first time and reduce the output of oil, so that increased prices. At the same time, we had the Federal Reserve allowing the U.S. government to increase their debt, so the Federal Reserve begins buying debt from the federal government, ends up increasing inflation, increase the money supply. So this two combinations led to very high inflation. Maybe your parents or your grandparents bitched about like how terrible the 70s were in this regard. So Nixon, when he was president, tried to put a whole host of price controls across several industries to try to rein this in. So the economist C. Jackson Grayson serves the chairman of the Price Commission. So it was his job, the buck kind of stopped with him, to determine where to set these prices at. So he ended up being like the central planner of the United States economy at the time. Very ironic, Nixon, the Cold Warrior, putting in Soviet-style price control and central planning. Grayson later wrote a book describing what it was like trying to set these price controls and the problems that he confronted. So the first lesson he took away from it is price controls mask real changes to economic fundamentals. So obviously they're implemented to fight inflation, to try to reduce inflation, but it assumes that all price changes are due to inflationary pressures. So it's due to an increase in money supply, due to an increase in money supply. But as we know, there's changes in supply and demand curves all the time. So there's many price changes that occur, and these are going on like constantly. The prices they display and they communicate information between parties. They show the relative scarcity of goods. They show when resources are better used in one industry because they're more needed in that industry, providing more value than in other industries. And these are masked. We can't tell this, what's going on when we institute price controls. We just know that there's fewer goods on the shelf at the end of the day. So price, which conveys this very important information, we're completely neglecting and covering up what it's telling us. Next is the role of profit is neglected or completely ignored. That assumes that profit is a result of taking advantage of consumers. We know that profit's what encourages resources to be used in the most valuable combination. So firms that are meeting consumer needs are earning a profit. It's a signal that these goods, these products are making consumers better off, and a signal to other firms to begin producing these products, to enter that market. And price controls also, by preventing prices from increasing, hold down profits for firms, and this discourages long-run investments. So it's going to end up keeping profits high in the long run because these firms taking in less revenue, they have less money to spend on capital improvements. So they're not going to be able to put in a new machine in their production facilities that increases their productivity, so lowers the cost of production, which is something that ends up bringing down price. Next, it begins to replace economic competition with political competition. So remember, there's still scarce resources. So what's the best way to obtain these scarce resources? Typically, there's competition within the market. Producers bidding up prices for resources so that they have those resources to produce the goods that consumers actually want. And when consumers actually want it, they'll be willing to pay a higher price. So those producers will be able to pay a higher price for the resources. You remove economic competition, you don't allow the price mechanism to work, there's still going to be competition because there's still scarce resources. So this shifts over to political competition. So you end up with people attempting to get resources through lobbying the government. And you get different price controls on different industries. Members of those industries end up lobbying government officials, trying to get them to pass different price controls that benefit them at the expense of others. Next, price controls normalize attitudes of reliance on government rather than consumers. So instead of firms focusing on profit and loss and on meeting consumer needs to operate, they end up focusing on government. So you get entrepreneurial efforts not on creating new products, not on better, cheaper ways to produce products, but you get it focusing on getting government favors. So they're hiring lobbyists to go out and try to get more favorable price controls to help them out, rather than using that money to figure out better ways to produce goods.
Welcome to class. Appreciate it. No problem.
I don't know if you guys enjoy it, but I always enjoy it.
Motorsport makes life better.
What the?
Motorsport makes life better.
I'm just going to turn down like 3 points, right?
Yeah.
Something else price controls do is they generate regime uncertainty. So the idea of regime uncertainty is you're not sure how regulations or how laws are going to change in the future. When you have these price control boards operating, messing around with prices, adding new industries, removing price controls from certain industries, firms become a lot less clear on what's going to happen in the future. And that makes it a lot more difficult to plan for the future. So when your ability to forecast is diminished, this raises the cost of planning, and you end up focusing on shorter and shorter term, when you can be more sure what's going to happen. And finally, price controls mask true economic problems. So it's framed as a response to a market failure, so speculation, greed, runaway inflation that they can't control. But it masks the underlying causes of what's going on. So maybe it's monetary policy that's driving higher inflation. Maybe there's tariffs that are increasing prices. We increase the tariffs, people end up paying more for goods and services. Maybe increase in prices due to regulation. New regulatory policy makes it more expensive for firms to produce goods. And now the prices are going up because of that. Maybe it's taxes that we're putting on firms that end up going through the higher prices on consumers. Maybe it's changes in relative scarcity. With price controls, we can't tell what's going on. We don't get these price increases. We don't know if it's going across the whole economy, if it's just in one industry, if it's just for one resource. Price controls, they mislead private citizens regarding both fundamental causes of perceived economic problems and solutions to address these problems. So obviously, if you want to decrease prices, firms can just be more productive. Increase their productivity, lower the cost of production. Obviously, it's easy to say in theory, but they need to figure out ways to do that. But they can do that to lower prices. But what price controls can do is that people see the solution to the problems of increasing prices is not to try to innovate and try to use advancements in order to lower the cost, that it's to just put a ban on increasing prices. There's other things that cause prices to rise. Like I mentioned, a bunch of potential causes a minute ago. If we want to lower prices, we should look at the cause, what's causing prices to increase, instead of trying to deal with the symptoms of it. So these 6 lessons come straight from C. Jackson Grayson and his experience trying in vain to lower prices. By the late 70s, inflation continued at like double digits, and at that point Nixon was out, Ford was out. It was like the end of the Carter administration. He was winding these down. Ford a little bit, and then Carter winding down these price controls. It was finally under Ronald Reagan. It was Carter, very end of Carter administration. He appointed Paul Volcker as a Federal Reserve chair. Carter gave him his blessing, and then Reagan gave him his blessing to do whatever he can to bring down inflation. Getting to monetary policy is a little beyond what we do with microeconomics, but there was a lot of pain. He increased interest rates substantially, helped bring down inflation, and we ended up going forward with low inflation without needing to do price controls in order to do that. Okay. So tying this in to a real world example, what is it that makes Uber such a valuable company? So taxi medallions, these are laws that artificially restrict supply. Basically, there's a certain number of taxi medallions, or like a license to be a taxi driver. And you have to purchase them from city governments. In New York City, before Uber took off, so like the mid-2000s, the price of a taxi medallion was $1 million. There were so many more people that wanted to be taxi drivers than there were medallions out there. So they restrict supply. The idea being, especially before GPS, difficult to know your way around a giant city, know all the best ways to take. So you want to restrict that to people who really knew what they were doing. Now that we carry a map in our pocket that literally tells us where to go and tells us the fastest way to get there, that's much less than a need in the modern world. But still, taxi medallions exist. Now, because we had this reduction of supply, or this artificial restriction, we ended up with a large deadweight loss, consumer surplus and producer surplus from these transactions that weren't able to take place. So like we talked about Airbnb, how that being that peer-to-peer rental being a potential way to get rid of some of that deadweight loss when there's rent control, Uber did pretty much the same thing. You can tell the textbook is a few years old because they feel like they have to explain what Uber is. But basically, users benefit from cheaper rides. It's much cheaper to take an Uber than it is a taxi. Operators benefit. They're able to operate a taxi-like service without having to get those super expensive licenses. And they're able to work, more on their own, work their flexible hours rather than the hours that are put into place by the taxi drivers that just give them a shift. So one of the beauties of Uber is that because you use an app rather than just sticking your hand out the street and calling a taxi, It allows these parties to communicate and to get together. It's much more convenient for both of them, and allows them to avoid taxi licensing laws. So their market value at one point, again, a couple of years ago, was $50 billion. So that gives you a sense of the deadweight loss that results from these taxi medallion restrictions. So because there's this restricted output, there's so many fewer rides taking place, Uber's able to come in, generate a value of $50 billion. So there's a lot of deadweight loss going on because of this restriction supply of taxi drivers. All right, that brings us to the end of the section on price controls and the black market. Do you guys have any questions about that section, about what we went over? All right, let's move into the economic effect of taxes. For this section, we're just going to analyze the effect of taxes that are placed on transactions. So not income taxes, but like things like sales taxes. So all over Arundel homes, the Supreme Court Justice wants to mark taxes are what we pay for civilized society. That may be true, but taxes also distort economic decisions by altering the incentives that consumers and producers face. So when taxing a specific good or service, these taxes impact selected groups differently, just like price controls. And these taxes, we'll look at excise taxes, sometimes called sin taxes. They reduce economic efficiency. So an example of an excise tax, the federal government imposes 18.4 cents per gallon tax on gasoline in 2015. The reason we call them sin taxes is because many of the things we place an excise tax on are things that have bad effects. So gasoline causes pollution. So it's a way to kind of raise revenue to offset the effects of pollution while at the same time reducing consumption. Other sin taxes include like cigarettes, gasoline, cigarettes, alcohol, things like that the government, a lot of people believe have negative side effects. Let's look at an example of the effect on cigarettes. So without the tax, equilibrium occurs at point A. I'll draw this to show you a simple way to do this. They kind of skip it on the slides. Okay. So the equilibrium is at $5 a pack. I'm going to draw this curve a little bit more steep because price elasticity of demand for cigarettes is going to be fairly inelastic. Remember, there's very few substitutes for something you're addicted to. Let's call this 4 million, and the price is $5. So now if we put a $1 per pack tax on cigarettes, they just show this as shifting up the supply curve by $1. An easy way to think of it is take a line that's going to be $1 and push it in until it hits the supply and the demand curve. Whoa. So they just draw the second supply curve up there, so think of it going through there. So in essence, we're shifting up the supply curve by $1. See if they have another. Yeah. So at first, firms are willing to sell 4 million packs. When we move up to this new equilibrium, to this S2, they're going to be willing to sell fewer packs at this price. Now, they're saying 3.7 million. Because the price elasticity of demand is so inelastic, consumers are not very responsive to price, again, because it's cigarettes. Use substitutes, addictive, all that. It's going to be pretty close to that initial amount. Now, the price is increased by $1 because of the tax. So in this case, consumers are going to pay $5.90 now for a pack of cigarettes. So even though we put a dollar tax on it, we're not increasing the price by $1. And that's because we have the supply and demand curves that are sloping, so we're hitting here and here. Now this price down there, this is what producers are going, or that sellers are going to be getting for the cigarettes. In this case, it's below $5. Remember, the tax is $1, so it ends up being $4.90. So producers receive a price of $5.90. That's what the customers are paying for the cigarettes with this dollar tax placed on it. But after they pay that dollar tax, they get left with $4.90. This lower price where it crosses the original supply curve at the new quantity demanded. So in this case, the consumers end up bearing 90 cents of the tax because they're now paying, instead of $5, $5.90. At the same time, producers, or sellers, get $4.90 where they used to get $5. So now they're paying 10 cents of the tax. So now, how much does the government receive? They get this whole area in this shaded box. So they get that $1 tax, the difference between the price consumers are paying and what sellers take in after they pay the tax, times the number of units. So it ends up with this whole green area there. Now remember, because there's a reduction in the quantity of cigarettes that are bought and sold on the market, you end up with deadweight loss. So the deadweight loss is going to be the area between those two, between the supply and demand curve. So those two little triangles right there. Now in the market for cigarettes, there's going to be very little deadweight loss relative to the tax revenue that's being taken in by governments. The reason why we see this, very little deadweight loss, is because the demand for cigarettes is very inelastic. Because consumers aren't going to reduce how many cigarettes they're buying substantially, we see very few trades actually not take place. So we're going from, well, this is billions of packs, so from 4 billion packs to 3.7 billion packs. It was a very small percentage decline. Because of that, we end up with a very small deadweight loss. So we say that this tax is pretty efficient, because there's very little deadweight loss going on, and the government's taking in a lot of tax revenue. All right, now let's look at the incidence of tax on gasoline. So if there's no gasoline tax, the market's in equilibrium, we end up with a price of $2.50 and the quantity of 144 billion gallons per year being sold. So we put on a 10 cent per gallon excise tax. That's going to shift up the curve from S1 to S2. It's going to go up because now the cost to sellers is now higher because of this tax that's being placed on. So now the difference, take where this new curve crosses the demand curve, the difference between that and the old supply curve at that quantity is going to be 10 cents. It'll be the same value as the tax that's being placed on. Now the quantity is going to decrease in this case from 144 billion gallons per year to 140 billion gallons per year. So again, we're seeing a relatively small drop, relative to the change in price. And that's because, again, gasoline is has very inelastic demand. Because, there's very few substitutes, especially in the short run, for gasoline. So consumers end up paying $2.58 after the tax. So they're up here where this new supply curve crosses the demand curve. And producers are going to receive $2.48. where crossing the old supply curve at the new quantity that's being sold. So you literally draw a dotted line down from where those cross the new quantity, where it crosses the original supply curve is the price that sellers are going to receive. Now initially, sellers would get $2.50 for gasoline for each gallon. Now they're getting $2.48. So they're paying 2 cents of this tax. The consumers are paying $2.58, so the cost of gas, what they're paying, went up by 8 cents. So in this case, consumers pay 8 cents of the tax, and sellers pay 2 cents of the tax. So even though you're placing this tax on sellers, so the gas stations are the one actually paying the government the tax, most of it ends up going to consumers. Consumers end up bearing most of the tax, not all of it. In this case, 20% is paid by the sellers. The previous cigarette example, 10% is going to the sellers. So who pays the tax is referred to as the tax incidence. So the actual division of the burden of tax between buyers and sellers in a market. It's not just, the tax isn't just paid by who it's actually levied on, who actually has to cut the check to the government. It's determined by the interaction of supply and demand, and based off of how elastic and inelastic the supply and demand curves are. I won't show it now, but these slides are on Canvas. You can go to them, click on this link to Marginal Revolution, and it's like a 10-minute video that explains basically how tax incidence works, going through the same supply and demand graphs that we did here. So it's a good way to help you study and get it, just a different person explaining it to you. So tax incidence, remember, is not whoever has the legal obligation to pay the tax. It's who ends up paying more of the tax due to the supply and the demand curves. So the one who is more inelastic is going to pay more of the tax. In this case, buyers, very inelastic compared to the sellers. So the buyers are going to end up paying more of the tax. In this case, 90 cents out of a $1 tax is being paid by consumers. Because they're not very sensitive to price, they're not decreasing how much they're willing to buy by very much. They don't have other goods they can go to that fulfill those needs. They'll end up paying more of the tax, bearing more of the burden of the tax. Next section, we're going to look at externalities. So, for the gasoline example, when you drive, that ends up polluting the environment. You don't bear the full cost of that. It's not just the two parties engaged in the transaction. The person selling you gas and then you buying the gas aren't affected. Everyone's affected by that pollution. So one way to help deal with it when other people are getting affected by your transaction is to place a tax on it, make it relatively more expensive. We'll be exploring that more in the next chapter. So let's look at this a different way. Let's say that for some reason the government thinks it's easier to do it this way, and people that buy gasoline are going to end up paying the tax instead of the people selling gasoline. So if buyers have the legal obligation to pay the 10-cent tax, what's going to happen is the demand curve is going to shift down, and it'll shift down by 10 cents. So if we put that little 10-cent wedge in there for the tax, we end up with the new demand curve crossing down here at 140 billion gallons per year, down from 144 billion gallons per year. You trace that up at that quantity to the original demand curve, you get $2.58, the price that consumers are going to be paying. We go where the new demand curve crosses the supply curve, that's $2.48. So if If buyers are the one that have to pay the tax, if they're legally required to write that check to the government every time they buy gas, they end up paying 8 cents out of that 10-cent tax. And the sellers, the gas stations, end up paying 2 cents out of that 10-cent tax. If you remember the numbers we worked with on the previous slide, just a minute ago, these are the same exact numbers. So it doesn't matter who ends up paying the tax, who physically writes the check. Again, it's determined by the supply and demand of the market. And it's determined by the relative slopes of the supply and demand curves. So moving a steep demand curve like we had for these examples, buyers don't change how much they buy when price changes. So the result is they end up taking more of the burden of the tax rather than the sellers. If there's a real shallow demand curve, remember that means demand is going to be elastic, so buyers are going to change how much they buy a lot when price changes. So then they wouldn't be forced to accept as much of the burden of the tax. So sellers in this case would end up paying a lot larger portion of the tax. And same basic idea for sellers. So if there's a very steep supply curve, sellers aren't going to change how much they supply to the market when price changes. So they're going to end up with more of the burden of the tax. Okay, and our final example in this section is the Federal Insurance Contribution Act, the FICA taxes. So 15.3% of your wages end up going to this. It helps fund Social Security and Medicare. So by law, employers pay half of this, and then you pay half of it. But who ends up with the burden of this tax? The answer is, who is less sensitive to changes in wages? So is that employers, the people that, they're the consumers of the labor market, or workers, the producers of it? They produce the labor and sell it to firms. Turns out workers are relatively insensitive to their wages, so they don't change their hours work decisions very much when their wages change. So workers end up with most of the burden of this tax. Turning to supply and demand graphs, which I'm sure you're tired of, this panel shows what an imaginary $1 per hour Social Security tax would be like. I'm using just $1 per hour, it's very simple. So whoever has the legal obligation to pay the tax, workers end up with most of the tax burden. So let's say you put this on employers, it's going to shift down the demand curve by $1. Now, supply of labor is relatively inelastic here, especially compared to demand. So we end up with 95 cents going to the supplier of labor. So in this case, going to workers. So workers pay 95% of the tax. Employers pay 5% of the tax. Now, if we put the Social Security tax paid on the workers, it's going to shift the supply curve to the left, so we go up by $1. We end up with the same result. We end up with $10.05, so 5 cents now being paid by the employers, 95 cents being paid by the employees. So whoever ends up actually paying the tax doesn't matter. In this case, with this hypothetical, very simple $1 an hour Social Security tax, 95% goes to consumers, or excuse me, to the workers. Only 5% is being paid actually by the firms. And this is because the supply of labor relatively inelastic. Workers don't change how many hours they work based on changes in their income, so they're going to be less sensitive to price. Now, obviously, governments would prefer to place the tax on the firms themselves, have the firms pay. Can anyone imagine why? A bit more psychology than economics.
I guess it's going to be just one and do the job and we work it for us.
Can you say that again?
So the firms would mostly pay the tax, right? So the employees wouldn't have to, I guess, use as much of a paycheck. So,
Yeah. The employees don't see the money that's coming out of their paycheck because the firms are the one paying. So even though they're bearing the burden of the tax, they're not physically cutting that check, so it doesn't feel as bad. That's why your income tax, you don't write a check at the end of the year. That's why they take it out every week, or I guess every pay period. So that way you're not physically paying for it, so it doesn't seem as bad to you. So you hide it, even though people are still paying the tax. If it's not as like obvious to them, it doesn't hurt as bad. It's tricky. You guys have any questions about this section? You're not going, on the exam, you're not going to have to draw one of these and figure out the price going from like $5 to $5.90 and $4.90. You will have to explain what's going on with this. I'm not going to have you like making up those numbers and stuff. So, just so you guys know. You don't have any questions? Set out early, it's Friday.